Imagine sitting on an airplane, seatbelt fastened, listening to the calm voice of the captain, wishing you a safe journey. The engines roar, the plane accelerates down the runway, and within seconds, the wheels lift off. A quiet sense of relief fills the passengers. Everything seems normal, but what none of them knew was that time was running out. Exactly 3 seconds after launch, what was supposed to be the start of a smooth flight from Ahmedabad to London turned into scene from a mystery that no one has yet been able to explain. The clock read 8:08 GMT when the Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner took off. A perfectly normal morning, clear skies, perfect visibility, nothing unusual. The crew was experienced, the plane was in good condition, and yet something impossible. As the plane reached an altitude of 55 meters, a normal and safe speed for this phase of takeoff, both engines began to fail, not because of a technical fault, nor due to lack of fuel, but because something or someone turned off the fuel switches in the cockpit. Yes, you heard that right. The two controls that keep the engines running have been manually moved from the on position to the off position, a control that immediately cuts off fuel flow to the turbine. And all this, with hundreds of lives, depend on the stability of this flight. This is when the most disturbing recording of the entire investigation begins. The cockpit recorder records the reactions of two professional pilots, both experienced and trained, completely surprised. "Why did you hang up?" one of them asked, in a voice full of panic and disbelief. "I didn't turn anything off," the other responds without hesitation. The silence that follows is more disturbing than any shout. How is it possible that both pilots deny doing what the data reveal? So who shut down the engines? The plane began to plummet, but before impact, desperate attempts were made to save the flight. When the pilots realized their mistake, they attempted to restart the engine. They reset the switches to operation. And for a brief moment, Engine 11 was showing signs of improvement, but it was too late. The plane didn't have enough altitude. There hadn't been time. There had been no miracle. 3 seconds from the ground, his fate was sealed. But that was only the beginning. What followed was even more confusing, inexplicable, and far more disturbing. How can a perfectly functioning plane lose both engines without any technical failure? How can two pilots claim they did nothing that could only be done manually? And why? Despite so many sensors and automated systems, did anyone see what really happened in that cabin? There were 242 people on board, 230 passengers, and 12 crew members, entire families, students, professionals, people who simply wanted to reach London. No one survived. None, except one. But the story of this lone survivor is as incredible as the crash itself. And what it reveals could completely change our understanding of this tragedy. Or worse, it could suggest that the real cause of the accident is still unclear. Right now, all we have is a hole in the sky, a mistake that wasn't a mistake, and a question that resonates in the minds of everyone who has listened to this recording. Why did you hang up? Or would it be more correct to ask, what actually caused the plane to crash? Imagine getting up early, packing your bags, taking a taxi, going through X-rays, and grabbing a quick coffee at the gate. Meanwhile, you're thinking about the texts you'll send upon arrival, the meetings you'll have to organize, and the longing for the family you left behind. Now, imagine it all ending 3 seconds after the plane took off. This is exactly what happened on Air India flight AI-171. The passengers didn't even have time to realize they were falling. There were no screams or violent turbulence, just a moment when everything seemed to stop. In the cockpit, as the plane lost lift, the pilots tried to understand controls that no longer made any sense. The engines were off, but not because of an error. You were logged out because someone turned it off, yet no one admits to having done it. The emergency systems were activated. The small ram turbine shut down automatically and spun with the wind to generate enough power for basic control of the aircraft. But time was of the essence. The altitude was ridiculously low. At this point, the Boeing was no longer airworthy. He slid like a heavy, silent body just before touching the ground. For a moment, The pilots thought they could turn around. They adjusted the fuel controls. Engine 1 responded, a glimmer of hope. But Engine 2 remained inactive. The weather wasn't cooperating. Land was approaching too fast. Anyone who has ever flown knows that there is a magical moment just after takeoff. The outside world seems to shrink, and you can feel the plane gliding safely through the sky. At that moment, many close their eyes, others listen to music, or simply breathe a sigh of relief. For the passengers of Flight AI-171, this moment lasted only a few seconds. Then everything fell apart. At 1:44 p.m. local time, the Boeing crashed head-on into a BJ Medical School building a few kilometers from the airport. Students were in class inside. Outside, pedestrians were fleeing the burning rubble. The impact was brutal. There was no time to issue warnings, evacuate, or do anything else. One moment, everything was normal. The next, the earth shook. All aboard, -1. They lost their lives. But what makes this tragedy even more disturbing is the fact that, even after weeks of investigation, experts have not been able to explain how can something so serious happen without any indication of technical error. The fuel cutoff switches, the very ones that had shut down both engines, were intact. They were intact. And most shockingly, they cannot be accidentally moved. They require physical force, conscious force. They must be pushed back with force. An accidental collision is impossible. Turbulence cannot activate them. And yet, they have been activated. This is very worrying. What if something similar had happened on other flights? What if it wasn't human error? Is there something about the systems that are supposed to protect us that we don't yet understand? It's not just a technical question, it's a personal one, because at one time or another, each of us has entrusted our lives to an airplane, to the skill of a pilot, to the integrity of a system, to the logic of a manual. How many times have you buckled up and looked out the window, hoping everything would be okay? How many times have you trusted the invisible, the silence, the automatic system? Now think about it. What if the cause of the accident was still flying? If this story shocked you, if it made you think, if you believe that tragedies like this should be understood and not forgotten, subscribe to our channel now. This way, we can continue to tell you stories worth telling. Like the video and share it with travelers and all those who believe in aviation. And most importantly, stay tuned, because the story of the sole survivor of this flight is about to begin. And what he saw, everything changes. Amid so many bodies, debris, and silence, a miracle happened. Literally, amid the twisted wreckage and the smell of fuel, a man stood up, looked around, and walked away. He wasn't saved. He wasn't ejected from the plane. He simply survived, and his story is as absurd as the accident itself. His name is Vishu. He's an economy passenger. Seat 11A, a seemingly ordinary seat, but one that would become the only safe place on the entire Boeing 787. His seat was right next to an emergency exit, and according to initial reports, he managed to unbuckle his seatbelt, partially open the already damaged door, and exit the plane on his own. He didn't eject. He didn't fly. There was simply an emergency exit that defied all logic and physics. But how do you survive a plane crash and get through the wreckage? The explanation, though technical, is frighteningly simple. The plane crashed at very low altitude. According to official reports, the Boeing only reached 625 km, about 190 meters, before the power drop. For an aircraft of this size, that's practically nothing. The height is equivalent to 2 30-story buildings, enough to cause massive destruction. But under very specific conditions, it's still possible to leave a gap to survive. And it was this lagoon that saved Vishu. Now comes the part that changes everything. In his statement, the passenger claims to have heard a loud bang fast 30 seconds after startup. The noise was so intense that he thought something had ruptured inside the fuselage. But when he looked out the window, he saw no fire or smoke, no visible sign of an explosion, just the dull, muffled sound of something breaking or collapsing. This seemingly insignificant detail raises a new question. What if the cause of the error wasn't the switches failing, but something that happened earlier and forced the pilots to take desperate measures? We are facing a new blind spot in research. It's rare for a passenger to hear an explosion without clear visual evidence, especially on a modern aircraft, where every system is monitored by dozens of sensors. The noise Vishu described wasn't picked up by the cockpit microphones, but came from the fuselage. This brings us to a previously overlooked possibility. What happens if there is an internal engine error? Something that produces no fire or smoke, but completely compromises thrust? Or worse, what if the pilots noticed something that forced them to desperately shut down their engines to avoid an even greater catastrophe? These questions open up a new area of speculation, especially when comparing the reports with technical data from other analyses. An independent group of aeronautical engineers suggested that the detected noise was related to a collapse of the valve system. And things are much more serious than they seem. On any commercial aircraft, landing flaps are essential for takeoff. They increase wing lift at low speeds and allow the aircraft to gain altitude safely. In the case of Flight AI-171, preliminary reports indicated that the landing flaps, the virus may not have spread properly. Worse still, they could have been recovered earlier than expected. If that had happened, the plane would never have taken off. The question is no longer who turned off the engines becomes much more serious. Was the plane destined to crash before it even left the runway? This hypothesis changes everything. It transforms the accident from a mystery lasting a few seconds into an invisible fault line, accumulated from the ground until the plane's last breath. Think about it. You board the plane, trusting the crew, the technology, the signals, but a single button, a single misadjustment can seal your fate before takeoff. What if this mistake happens more often than we think? What if this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of a system that is silently failing? The story of Vishu, the sole survivor, isn't just a matter of luck. It's a matter of timing, location, and maybe even a little twist of fate. But what he heard, what he felt, could key piece to reopen an investigation that many would have already wanted to close. Because when the only witness emerges from the rubble and says something exploded, maybe the time has come. Listen to the data again, reread the report, and start asking questions again. If the engines had been manually stopped, and if no one had admitted to stopping them, then perhaps the right question is no longer who did it, but why would anyone do such a thing? Here, the investigation takes an even more delicate turn. Behind the scenes of commercial aviation, there is a detail that few passengers know, but which experts comment on with concern. Flap failures on takeoff are among the most underreported accidents in the industry. Often, the error can be corrected within seconds, allowing the flight to continue normally. However, this can sometimes turn disastrous. In the case of AI-171, unconfirmed information, but coming from sources inside the investigation, indicates that the electronic valve recording was inconsistent. It's possible that their takeoff was mistimed or that they were removed prematurely. This kind of situation can happen on an aircraft like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. It's like clipping your wings before you jump. A short break. Let's recap. The plane took off normally. In 3 seconds, he lost power. Engines manually turned off. The pilots are in shock. A detonation or explosion heard by a passenger. There is no sign of technical fault. And now, the flaps may have been retracted at the most critical moment of the flight. If all this seems fragmented, don't be fooled. These seemingly unrelated elements form a subtle pattern, one that only becomes apparent too late. According to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, between 2009 and 2022, more than 130 incidents involving landing flaps during takeoff on commercial flights were recorded. Many of these incidents were resolved quickly and without casualties. However, some, such as Spanair Flight 5022 in 2008, ended tragically. And oddly enough, the similarities are uncanny. Flaps retracted, engines running, but insufficient lift to keep the plane in the air. In other words, the plane flies, but it doesn't climb. Have you ever experienced this sensation in your dreams, running without moving your legs, wanting to fly but being pulled down by something invisible? This is the closest thing to what the AI-171 pilots felt. You weren't flying a defective plane, you were trying to fly a plane sabotaged by an invisible defect. And what makes it all the more disturbing? This error could have been human. A forgotten detail, a misplaced switch on the instrument panel, or perhaps a decision made under pressure to gain precious seconds before takeoff. So, faced with an imminent collision, the only option was to shut down the engine, try to restart them, and hope to regain control of the plane. But at this point, control had been lost. Vishu, the survivor, said he felt no real thrust. According to him, the plane felt heavy, as if it was being dragged painfully across the sky. This statement, coming from someone who had never studied aeronautical engineering, confirms what the figures show. The plane never reached maximum lift. It never entered climb mode. It simply took off and crashed. But perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: how many other flights are taking off today, right now, that carry the same risk? What remained, in the end, was not just the debris scattered across the BJ Medical School campus. It was not just the victims identified in tears and silence, nor the sober technical reports that attempted to describe the chaos. What remained, and still resonates, was a doubt that no one could silence. What was the real cause of the crash of Flight AI-171? In the days following the accident, a partial conclusion was drawn. The official report stated the engines were stopped manually. The switches worked perfectly. There was no mechanical failure or external malfunction. Everything points to human error. End of story. But is it really like that? The pilot's notes contradict this conclusion. Their reactions, recorded with precision, reflect confusion, surprise, and despair. "Why did you turn it off?" asks one. "I didn't turn it off," replies the other. Neither admits it. In fact, both seem genuinely stunned. Is it possible that they both made the same mistake at the same time, without realizing it? Is it possible that something else happened in that cabin? Something that even the tape recorder couldn't capture? Let's return to the testimony of Vishu, the sole survivor. An ordinary man in an ordinary place, listening, an unusual noise. A few seconds after takeoff, an explosion. No visible signal, no alarm, but he hasn't forgotten anything. This leads us to believe that engine stalling may be a reaction and not the cause. Had the flaps been retracted, the plane would not have been able to gain altitude or would have risked crashing into a densely populated area. Would the pilots have decided to shut down the engines to force an emergency maneuver? To prevent a more serious explosion? To try to keep the plane in a glide, even if the chances of success were slim? We don't know, and we may never know, but one thing is certain. The line between failure and decision, between error and reaction, is much thinner than we would like to admit. This accident reveals much more than a simple technical problem. It reveals a very real and worrying human and systemic fragility. A state-of-the-art aircraft, piloted by expert professionals, crashed. Not because the technology was lacking, but perhaps because too much importance was given to it. How often do we act automatically in our daily lives? How often do we press buttons without thinking, follow instructions without question, and trust systems we don't understand? It may seem like an exaggeration, but the logic is the same. And that's precisely why this tragedy affects us so deeply. It's not just about aviation. It's about vulnerability. It's about how, even surrounded by technology and precision, the fault may lie in a small gesture, a misinterpretation, or a series of events that only make sense after it's all over. Vishu survived, not by a miracle, but for a few seconds, for meters, thanks to an improbable chain of events. He didn't jump. He wasn't saved. He simply survived what seemed impossible to survive. And now he is the last living witness to a story that still seems incomplete. We may never have all the answers. Some tragedies may not exist to be explained, but to remind us of what we must avoid. If this story touched you and made you think about the fragility of our security, subscribe to the channel now. This will allow us to continue sharing stories that, however difficult, deserve to be heard. Like the video and comment on what you think really happened in the cockpit. What would you have done? Would you have trusted? Would you have recognized the danger? Your participation here makes a difference. Together, we can continue to research, to ask questions, and to remember, because tragedies must not be forgotten. They must change us. Thanks for watching. And get ready, because the next video is about another flight disappeared without a trace, and the strange signal was picked up before the last transmission. See you there.